Joining us live from Washington, D.C. is Aaron Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment. Is also a former U.S. diplomat who has formulated U.S. policy on the Middle East and the Arab-Israeli peace process. Aaron, great to have you back on the show. Let's start with Joe Biden. He says it's a moment of risk, but also an opportunity, I guess, to build a peaceful and stable and sovereign Syria. What are going to be the greatest obstacles, though, in the days ahead for Syria?
Well, first, before we leave Mr. Biden, there's only 6 weeks left on the Biden clock. And it's unclear to me, although we have the president-elect's first term to judge how he's going to look at the Syrian situation. And during those 4 years, he was talked out of finally redeploying American forces and withdrawing the 900 that we have in Syria. His tweets indicate that he's not interested in getting involved and is urging and basically recommending that the U.S. stay out. So that is a problem. It is not the main problem. The main problem, I think, is clear. How to turn this extraordinary moment, the end of the 54-year brutal, authoritarian, kleptocratic regime of the Assads, into a moment of opportunity. And herein lies, I think, the real challenge and the real difficulty. In the last 20 years, every time an Arab dictator was overthrown, whether it was Ben Ali in Tunisia, Mubarak in Egypt, Abdul Salah in Yemen, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, every single time, what followed was either authoritarian rule and repression, no governance, or bad governance. And that's the real challenge, it seems to me, for Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, and the coalition of Sunni Islamist elements that have scored a remarkable military victory. How to turn that into good governance, inclusion, and security and prosperity for the 23 million Syrians who have suffered far too long. I think it's going to be a very, very tough challenge.
I mean, you've seen this region for decades now, Aaron. So what would you say are some of the steps needed, absolutely needed in this transitional period?
Well, first of all, you're going to need a commitment from those who hold the power, which are the Sunni militias and the groups, some of whom, even though Mohammed Abu Julani, his real name is Ahmed Shara, and he's taken to wearing civilian clothes, and he's saying and doing all the right things, providing space for minority groups, Christians in Aleppo, to prepare for Christmas. He's allowed the international media to come in. He's talked about the need to coordinate with the international community with respect to chemical weapons. He's saying all the right things. The problem, I think, is that it's going to be very difficult for these groups to essentially abandon their relatively strict Islamic code. They're not the Taliban in Afghanistan, but how are they going to reconcile the reality that in the capital of Damascus, for example, which is largely secular, traditional, you have women who are not covered, you have the consumption of alcohol. And it just seems to me at some point, the International Committee Resolution 2254 calls for a political transition in which the opposition, and frankly, the opposition and the government right now are essentially one and the same. It calls for the drafting of a constitution and for elections. I mean, I think unless HTS is prepared to step back and essentially look at itself as an agent of delivery and allow a political process to really take root, it seems to me it's going to be extremely difficult to govern 23 million people and to control all of these areas. So again, I think we're a long way away from what I hope will be the process that will gain traction. Right. And will take the Syrian people closer to where they want to be. I'm just not sure that it's going to be such an easy lift to get there.
Aaron, does it require direct involvement, whatever you want to call it, guidance, advice, from the international community, meaning, not just the Western powers, but also Arab neighbors? But particularly, just want to go back to the point you were making about what Donald Trump has said. He wants to stay out of Syria, but some of the early conversations we've had would suggest that that's not going to be easy, it's not going to be possible because of the level of U.S. involvement right now in Syria. I mean, whether it comes to sanctions, there are still troops there. It's going to be difficult, to leave Syria to Syrians as Donald Trump would like to have it.
I mean, I think that's right. And again, we can't save or redeem Syria. The Syrians have essentially become the agents of their own redemption. And they've proven that Syrian groups who appear to be in favor of inclusion and the protection of the rights of minorities can create space for a political process. I'm just not at all sure right now how it's going to work. You're going to need tremendous amount of funding to an economy that has been essentially hollowed out. Who's going to provide that funding? HTS is a foreign terrorist organization according to U.S. law. That means it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, legally impossible, for the United States to directly engage HTS. And funders are, I guess, European countries and as well as in the Gulf. But again, that is going to require commitment on the part of those who now have the power. And those are the militias and the Sunni groups, to essentially commit to a process that you and I would recognize as something that is transparent, inclusive, and essentially would treat all Syrians with the same status. And right now, the Shura Council of HTS essentially does not permit representation by Kurds or Druze. So this is where Islamic law and Sharia is going to bump up against what I suspect are the aspirations, more secular aspirations, of how many Syrians see the future of their country. And how these two things are going to be reconciled right now is unclear to me. Again, if HTS made a strategic decision to basically pull back and allow this political process to unfold, perhaps it could gain traction. But they're Islamists, and I think they're going to want the country to be guided by those tenets, and there's going to be a conflict as a consequence.
Right. And Aaron, we know that Assad's regime collapsed while Russia and Iran were distracted by other conflicts. I mean, what are the chances of these powers, who invested so much in Syria for decades, shifting their focus back to Syria? I mean, and could Assad ever regain any legitimacy back in Syria?
No, I think the Assad family is done. The Russians, though, in giving him sanctuary, and remember, he's in good company because Vladimir Putin is under sanction. Vladimir Putin is under an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court. Neither of these individuals probably will ever be brought to The Hague to be tried, unfortunately. But it'll be interesting to see how the Russians, who have provided sanctuary to this brutal authoritarian killer, who has essentially been responsible for the deaths of at least 500,000 Syrians, how the Russians are going to negotiate with HTS and whatever government emerges to secure their own base rights. They've got a warm water port in Tartus along the coast, and they've got an air base at Khmeimim, which has been used to support Russian activities in Africa, as well as in other areas of the Middle East. How are they going to negotiate with the new powers to secure those rights when they're giving sanctuary to a man who's been so brutal in murdering his fellow Syrian citizens? That's one issue. I think the Iranians will continue to try to meddle. And if HTS and the militias can't find a way to secure the country, I suspect there will be an Iranian effort to gain influence in parts of Syria. It's going to be a very tough lift because Hezbollah, which was the agent for the Iranians in Syria, helped to save Assad in 2015, which the Russians essentially did. Hezbollah is so hollowed out as a consequence of the Israeli campaign over the last several months that it really does limit the amount of influence I think that Iran would have. The big power on the block is Turkey. The Turks are probably the only country, because of their liaison relationship with HTS, that knew and encouraged this offensive. So Turkey is the country to watch, I think. And Erdogan's objectives are clear. He wants almost 3 million Syrians in Turkey to return home. And he wants to figure out a way to break the U.S. connection with the Kurdish elements that it supports, because he's convinced that the core of the SDF is essentially PKK, mortal enemy of Turkey. So it'll be fascinating to see. And then, of course, you've got the Israeli equities, concern over missiles and chemical weapons, loose chemical weapons, and concern about their border on the Golan Heights and its vulnerability to some of these Islamist groups. So the foreign powers are going to continue to meddle in Syria, and it's not going to make the job of reconstruction or political reconciliation any easier.